Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video. Myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a very short video on the tariffs. Just one little point I want to make about the tariff trade war situation in the United States, where the US Trump administration has put these incredibly high tariffs on certain countries, but tariffs across the board. And I've already discussed all the mechanisms behind that. But the question, as I discussed yesterday, was, well, okay, what's this for? What's the end goal here? Because tariffs aren't an end in and of themselves. You know, they shouldn't be seen as a way to generate income, because the income you're generating is from your consumers. So therefore, it just becomes a tax. If this is just to generate money, then the people paying for this are the importers, who then pass it on to the wholesalers, to the distributors, to the consumer. Okay, so this is therefore a tax on the consumer. But the end goal, I would assume, is that you are using this to onshore your manufacturing, to create jobs in the US, to eventually, you know, make sure that you are self-sufficient and that you are full of manufacturing jobs, and you aren't some kind of mature service economy, that you're bringing back the old school manufacturing jobs. The problem is that, you know, those jobs are done very, very cheaply elsewhere around the world. So, you know, in order to compete with those and to export this stuff, you're going to have very cheap labor to do that. Now, what has happened is that most clothes have been made in China, and then, you know, the US has tried to move that manufacturing towards places like Vietnam that are much more US friendly. As Tom Malinowski says, but when looking at the weirdly huge Vietnamese tariffs, you know, 90%, they claim that Vietnam has 90% tariffs. I've told you this has nothing to do with tariffs. It's to do with how they're calculating this pertaining to either a trade deficit, trade surplus, but usually a trade deficit, and working out your from a US point of view, exports as a percentage of imports, and then dividing it by 2. So 90% there is this idea that you're buying way more in from Vietnam than you're exporting to Vietnam. And in fact, you know, that is seen as bad to the Trump administration. But actually, you want those cheap goods, and you ain't going to be able to make them in the US. The only way that you make cheap goods like that in the US is having really cheap labor, because that's what Vietnam provides, right? So to become competitive, you're just going to have to probably strip down employment rights to make it cheaper to employ people, etc., etc. You are trying to turn, I guess, American clothing manufacturers into sweatshops or something. Anyway, the end result is that turns into a 46% tariff on Vietnam. So this is but one of the many dumb and insane things about the trade war. But for years, we've been trying to push industries out of China, our biggest adversary, into Vietnam, which has become increasingly pro-American. And now these geniuses put an even bigger tariff on Vietnam than on China, although there are arguments that actually the tariff on China is added to the 20% previously, so it might actually be bigger. But you get the broader point. It is genius, says someone else. Buy American, and you have to worry about it. Or, you know, someone's trying to defend the tariffs in saying, hey, it's okay, just buy American. And the reply to that from Tom Malinowski is that over 98% of the clothes we buy in the US are imported. So we can pay the tariff tax for them, or we can train hundreds of thousands of Americans to stitch clothes, diverting our workforce from the advanced manufacturing it should be doing, and still pay more. So in other words, that even if you were to onshore all those jobs, you would end up paying more for that clothing than if you just bought it originally from Vietnam. So either way, it's inflationary. And then you're saying, well, if we don't want to see this as a tariff, then we have to employ cheap labor and it becomes inflationary. Or we just keep buying from Vietnam, but we're going to buy it at a price that's now 46% higher, which is inflationary. So either way, it's inflationary. And why are you doing that to Vietnam? Because you don't really, I mean, do you really want to have massive clothing manufacturing of that sort? You know, somewhat low skilled, not the high tech, you know, I don't know, car manufacturing, that kind of machinery going on, or the arms industry. You're going back to cheap clothing to supply for the US, because 98% of your clothing in the US is coming from outside. Because it is cheap. So it's just looking like you're taxing and you're forcing inflation on your own consumers. Just insanity. That's just Vietnam. That's just looking at Vietnam there. Crazy times. Anyway, I just thought I'd have that little rant with you. Take care. Speak soon.